Hello world, welcome to my first cooking class. This one is on cheese sauce, and that's because one of the best, most basic things you can learn is how to make a basic cheese sauce. You can use it for pasta, you can use it over vegetables, you can use the basic roux that we're going to learn how to make to thicken soups and stews. There's so many different things you can do with this as an option. So that's why I decided to start with cheese sauce. Also, with the COVID-19 quarantine currently going on, I've noticed a lot of the already pre-made, prepared macaroni and cheese boxes are flying off the shelves. So I suspect some people may want to eat macaroni and cheese, for example, and they can't find their regular boxed versions. So hopefully after you watch this video, you can learn how to make your own cheese sauce, and then you can just buy plain pasta, make your own cheese sauce, and you're gold. Okay? So the first thing we're going to look at is the recipe for today. Now you'll notice if you look up any other mac and cheese sauce recipes online that mine is definitely modified from your basic recipe. And part of that is because of what I just happened to have on hand, and part of it is because I wanted to show you some extra options. But you can do a very basic cream sauce and add some cheese to it, and I will let you know how you can modify this recipe to get kind of a more basic version as we go. So one of the first things you need to know is that cheese sauce, sometimes called Mornay sauce as a French word, is a daughter sauce to the mother sauce known as bechamel, also known as white sauce. So these are French words because we're talking about French cuisine. That doesn't mean that cheese sauce or white sauce is um, limited to the French, of course. It simply means that we're going to use the French words for it because, they've kind of cornered the market on hot cuisine. I mean, just think about it. The words hot cuisine are both French. So it just means high cooking, okay? We can use hot cuisine ideas and apply them to normal cooking without having to make it high. So this is a very normal farmhouse kind of recipe that you can use with anything. So white sauce in general depends on what's called a roux, again another French word. All that means is a cooked mix of flour and fat. And so today we're going to be using butter as our fat. Butter itself is actually a mixture of milk fat and water, in case you didn't know that. So you'll see it bubbling a little bit when it cooks. That's the water in the butter bubbling off. Now, if you happen to use cooking oil, you can use bacon fat, you can use any kind of fat you want. Those are going to be a slightly different texture, and it won't bubble as much when you cook it. But you can use any kind of fat. The things that are happening chemically here is that when the fat and the flour combine at heat, it changes the flour chemically and it converts the starch inside the flour molecules, it converts it to something that can absorb and thicken sauce. And that's the whole point of cooking it. Also, when you cook flour, I'm not sure if you're aware, flour has become one of those things that it's tragically become more and more common for raw flour to come out of the factories tainted with E. coli, maybe some other bugs. I'm not sure. I just know about the E. coli. And so, generally speaking, when you're using raw flour, you should cook it. Sometimes you might not be able to cook it in the recipe, and so you can actually bake the flour in your oven and then use it. So if you wanted to eat raw cookie dough, for example, apparently the raw eggs aren't not as much a problem anymore as the raw flour is. So you bake your flour now and then you add it to your raw cookie dough. We are cooking our raw flour not just to remove the possibility of E. coli getting us sick, but also because Raw flour has a raw taste to it, and that's not a pleasant taste when you're looking at sauce. So you have to cook it a little bit to get that raw taste to go away. Now, if you cook it more than what we're going to cook it today, you actually can develop a completely different flavor coming out of the flour, which most people describe as a nutty flavor. So that's an option. You don't have to cook it for the minimum amount of time I'm cooking it today. You can cook it darker. Just don't burn it. That's the only thing. One of the things that you need to know about the two things that we're doing right now is that the flour and butter ratio is something that's actually pretty flexible. Basically, what we're doing here is we're taking flour and we're using it, once we convert it chemically to the thickening agent, we're using it to thicken water. Now, what water are we talking about? We're talking about the water that's in milk. However, just plain water thickened with flour is fine for soups because you have a lot of flavor in your soup to make up for it. But in a sauce, it's very plain. You put it that way. So we're going to be using a lot of fat. Now, I have adjusted the recipe that I'm doing today to moderate the fact that I was a little low on milk. Okay, so what I chose to do is I used a combination of butter for my fat. I used full fat milk. I used buttermilk, which is only 1.5% of fat compared to full fat milk is about 3%. And I also added in some light sour cream. So it's not full fat sour cream, it's light sour cream. And again, you can modify it. What you want to do is basically kind of keep a general ratio of flour to fat to liquid. And the basic ratio is going to be 1 to 1 to 1. So what I mean by that is 1 tablespoon of butter, for example, you cook that with 1 tablespoon of flour, so equal amounts of butter and flour, and then 1 cup of liquid. So that is the most basic of your ratios. Now that's going to give you about a medium consistency sauce. In my recipe today, I used more butter because normally what I would do, I didn't happen to have it on hand. I would substitute some of my milk with either half and half or whipping cream, which has a much higher fat percent than normal milk, because I like a good rich sauce. But because I didn't have those two, I cheated a little by just adding more butter. Okay, you can add dairy fat in whatever form you want. You can add it in as sour cream, you can add it as butter, you can add it as butter fat in milk. Whatever you want. It just needs to have enough fat to taste good, basically. So 1 to 1 to 1 is the normal ratio. Again, you'll see in my recipe, if you go back, I'm using 8 tablespoons, if you want to call it, of butter to only 4 tablespoons of flour, and then I've used 4 cups of liquid. So I've upped my butter, but I kept the flour about the same. Now, this sauce didn't come out super thick. If I wanted to thicken it, I would have upped my flour amounts. However, because I already knew I was going to be adding in the sour cream later, which is already thickened, I decided to go ahead and keep my flour ratio down and up the thickening power with the sour cream. And again, the thickness of your sauce only depends on this ratio, flour to butter to liquid. So if you don't like it the first time you make it, modify your ratio. Add a little bit more flour, add a little bit less liquid, whatever you want to do. It's up to you. I've seen a lot of recipes online that use 2 tablespoons of flour, 2 tablespoons of butter, and 1 cup of milk. Totally fine. So it basically doubles your basic ratio. Totally fine. One thing I should note is that you need to get your butter melted first. So that's what we have going on here. The butter needs to be totally melted before you add the flour in. And that's so that it cooks evenly and there's not big clumps, and it's just way better if your butter is already melted. So you melt your butter in and then you take a whisk and you whisk the flour in so that there's no lumps. It doesn't take very much effort, but you gotta try to make sure you get all the lumps out so that you don't have to deal with those later, because that just gets to be an ugly mess. So the technique I'm using here is you do the outside of the pan and then the inside of the pan. And I'm turning down the heat. It's really easy to burn this kind of stuff while you're cooking, so make sure, especially if you use gas, make sure you keep the heat low enough that you're not going to be burning it. After you've done melting those two things together, in this particular situation, I crushed some garlic and I added it at this stage because I love garlic. But garlic is one of those things that you kind of need to do as a cooked thing because raw garlic has a real big bite, so you need to saute it a little bit. And that's what I'm doing here, is sauteing the garlic into the roux before I add any liquids. So the first liquid I'm going to be adding is the buttermilk, and that's going to look a little bit different from regular milk. So, when you're watching this, kind of be like, oh, there's chunks. There's actually supposed to be chunks in buttermilk. The regular milk, I didn't take a video of me adding that, so it's not chunky. If your regular milk is chunky, you got a problem there. So you add that in, you start stirring it around. As you can see, mine has already started getting a little clumpy, and that means that it's working. Okay, so the flour is already thickening the liquid that's in there. And so here I'm adding 1 cup of regular milk, and I added 2 more after this stage. And then you whisk it around. You see it's kind of lumpy. You just whisk it till it's smooth, no more lumps. Then I added after I added all the liquids, I added my sour cream. I added salt. So I used about half of regular salt and half of fresh ground pink Himalayan salt because it's got a few micronutrients. I like to add it, but it's not as salty as regular salt. So I use regular salt to kind of make sure that the salt quotient's actually where it tastes good, but it's not overpowering. Then I add in nutritional yeast. Now you might wonder why nutritional yeast. And that's because one, it adds a nice flavor. Nutritional yeast has kind of I guess you'd call it a savory flavor, and it goes extremely well with cheese and milk and those kind of things. Also, nutritional yeast, remember we're talking nutritional yeast flakes, not regular baking yeast. It also adds an incredible amount of vitamin B12 to whatever you are adding. So I think 1 tablespoon equals some 500% of your daily value of vitamin B12. I just happen to like to add it to my cooking. B vitamins are water soluble, and so you have to have them as a regular part of your diet, or your body doesn't store them up. And so I add nutritional yeast to pretty much everything that can stand it. Okay, after I added all of my flavorings, and again, there's optional flavorings you can use if you look at the recipe. A lot of people use nutmeg for this, and that is kind of an unusual choice. Many people associate nutmeg with pumpkin pie, but it adds a nice complexity of flavor to cheese sauce. So you can consider using that. I don't show it here, but I did add some garlic powder because again, I can't get enough of garlic. So I added a little bit more garlic powder as well. I like fresh garlic and I like garlic powder, and I tend to use them both in the same recipes. And so after you've done that, you've whisked it all in, it should be fairly smooth. Once it starts to thicken up, so it's already starting to bubble. You can see that here. It's already starting to bubble a little bit. I dumped in my cheese. Now, I didn't have grated cheese this time because we just didn't have grated cheese. We had sliced cheese for sandwiches. So I cut up my sliced cheese into chunks to make it easier for it to whisk in, and I added it to the sauce that was already thick. You reserve your cheese until your sauce is already thick because it's kind of the finishing touch and you're just about done. So you melt your cheese in, you whisk it around until it's nice and smooth, and then at this point, you can turn it off. As long as it's already thickened, you can turn it off. And you can also let it simmer on low, but if you let it simmer on low, make sure it does not overcook. Always keep stirring it every couple minutes. Now at this point, I chose to put my sauce to the side because you can make sauce ahead of time. You can actually make it days ahead of time and store it in the fridge as anytime you want to add cheese sauce, you just pop it out, warm it up, and pour it over something. At this point, I made my cheese sauce first, and then I cooked my pasta. And so I added salt to a pot of water, and all that does is creates a chemical reaction whereby the water boils faster because I'm a little impatient. It also um, gives the pasta a little bit more flavor by cooking it in salt water. Now, one thing you'll hear from true Italian cookers or cooking, the one person I was told about this was one of my college friends, is that Italian cooking always adds a little bit of oil, olive oil especially, to the pot while the pasta is cooking. And that helps the pasta not stick together. Now, this kind of pasta is not uh, problematic if you don't add oil. I didn't this particular time. However, if I was making linguine or angel hair pasta or spaghetti, I would definitely add some oil to the water to help it keep from clumping while it cooks. Now, when you pour it out into the colander, all that oil goes away. So you're not eating it, okay? If you wanted to eat your pasta with oil, super simple. Put it back and you put it in your serving dish or put it back in the pot and then throw some butter in there or throw some olive oil. In fact, you could just have a super simple sauce if you just cook pasta, throw some butter in. Um, I personally would put some crushed garlic in, stir it around, maybe cut up some herbs, and voila, you have a delicious sauce. It's really easy to make pasta taste good. In this particular case, of course, that was not what I was going for. And so I put the pasta back in the pot, cooked and drained. And then I added my finished cheese sauce. So the cheese sauce is completely thickened at this point. As you can see, my cheese sauce is not very thick, but it was thick enough. I was happy with it. So that's, my kids were happy with it. Had a good flavor, and that's all you really need, right? Um, but it could have been a little bit thicker if I had chosen to add more flour at the beginning, or I could have also chosen to thicken it with a little bit of cornstarch because, again, flour does have a bit of a flavor. A lot of people thicken with cornstarch, and that's totally fine. In fact, if you look at a package of instant throw in a pot mac and cheese, you will often find some kind of starch as an ingredient. You might not even see flour in there. And that is because it's a very quick thickener. Cornstarch, um, you have to cook flour to kind of activate it. Cornstarch is like, bam, there you are, you're thickened. That's why you can have instant jello, right? Cornstarch. There's a few other starches. Potato starch acts the same way. However, it has a bit of a chalky taste, which is one of the reasons why I personally prefer to make a cheese sauce with flour. I could have chosen to thicken it a little bit with some extra starch. If you want to do that, you have to add the starch to milk or liquid before you add it to your sauce. Otherwise, it will clump up and you will never get it back again. It's disgusting. So you need to mix those two together to make a sauce between the starch and the water or the starch and the milk before you add it to your finished sauce or your work in progress. Okay, now you'll notice that the color is white, and that is because we made a white sauce. Also, I used a combination of a white cheese, Munster cheese, as well as cheddar cheese. Now, if I had put in, I could have added 2 cups of shredded cheddar cheese for this, and that would have been totally fine. It would have thickened my sauce a little bit more than the 1 cup I did put in, and it would have given it more color. If you do look at those recipe ingredients for the box mix, you'll see that they are orange because they've added the color orange into the mix, okay? That's why it's orange. It's not the natural color of the food. It's orange because American consumers demand orange when they think cheese sauce. Cheese sauce is not naturally orange. It could be a little bit more orange if you add a lot of cheddar. So it tastes great. It's really simple. I highly encourage you guys to give it a try. Put it over some cooked broccoli. Try it over, any kind of vegetable you like or any kind of pasta. You can actually use this to make lasagna, a cream sauce for lasagna. And if you want to experiment with that, you just make your cream sauce and then you add whatever kinds of ingredients you're going to add to your lasagna, whether ground meat or vegetables, and then layer it with the ricotta cheese mixture along with the pasta noodles in the pan. Super simple, delicious. One final note, if you guys enjoyed this, I would love to hear some feedback and hear what kind of recipes you'd like to see next. Take care of yourselves.